Welcome to Designing Cities for All, another episode, and it's part of our 2-year-long activity and research program,
where we take a deep dive into designing products, spaces, and systems for all. Just because you feel safe, or you feel welcome, or you feel included, doesn't mean that everyone else around you feels the same way.
We don't stand alone. We're not individuals that somehow planet or an island, you know?
And I think that's the beautiful thing of a diverse society, that everyone can add something from out of their own experience.
Things won't change just if we just let things happen.
I think if you can build relationships and use design as a tool to build those relationships, the better off we're all going to be.
Everything around us was once designed and can therefore be redesigned.
Belonging is a very, very important concept.
You can try to take someone's place for a while, but you don't have the lived experience.
Let's begin by acknowledging similarity and affinity.
Be a person, not your role.
I think inclusion is not a choice.
Inclusion happens by design or not at all.
In order to create truly inclusive public spaces that are accessible to everyone, we have to underline what everyone actually is.
Real inclusion, it's got nothing to do with the norm, but it's like something that we create from all different perspectives.
You know, so even when we bring everybody at the table, does everybody's voice count the same?
Because it's a big question of who tells these stories.
You know, the more I explore about other cultures, other religions, is the more ingredients I have to make the architecture and to answer the questions I get from society.
Not fitting in was a blessing, or I would have turned out just like you.
And a warm welcome to you all. We just saw the wrap-up of the first year of Designing Cities for All, eventful year. And of course, Designing Cities for All is our 2-year-long research and activity program in which we take a deep dive into designing cities, products, places, and systems for all. Today, we kick off our new Designing Cities for All Fellowship, curated by researcher and scholar Daphina Misiedjan. A warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
You're specialized in environmental justice and human rights. Yep. We're going to talk about that later, but and we'll get to know her work a bit better as we dive into the topics of her fellowships. What will she be researching? We'll tell you that tonight. But we've also got 2 guests joining us on request of you, and that is activist and scholar Nawal Mustafa and Associate Professor Rosalba Icaza. Both share part of the same mission with Daphina, and they both will be joining us through Zoom. We see them on the screen up above in the corner of your screen. Welcome to all of you. Tonight, we don't have only live people here in the studio, so a warm welcome to you as well, but you are watching us at home too. If you would like to join in the conversation, that is possible. If you take any device at your disposal and go to menti.com, there you will be asked for a code. If you key in the code 85128101, then you can join in the conversation. The code will appear on screen as well. I'll repeat it for now. So go to menti.com, and there you will need the code 85128101. Again, we'll leave the code on screen so you can take your time joining us through menti.com. All right, let's get to work. Daphina, you're an assistant professor in human rights and the environment at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. What does that entail?
Yes, so I basically did my PhD, which was surrounding the issue of water. I looked at how water could be made more accessible for those who don't have access, and also how you could manage it in combination with how we manage water in general. And I saw very interesting things that came up in that. And I thought, okay, I need to look more into this, not only into water, but in general, how are natural resources, how are they managed, and how do they collide with human rights? What are some of the challenges there? And that is what I'm researching now.
And what sparked your interest in water way back when?
Way back when? Well, it started off when about 10 years ago, when I actually was facilitating more trainings on land rights. So I went to Suriname, which I'm originally from, and I discussed land rights with indigenous communities there, because there's a lot of land issues there in Suriname. And one of the elders actually came up to me and she asked the question, okay, you explained to us these land right issues, but we actually also have water issues. So what can we do with these water issues? We don't have any access. We're not connected to the infrastructure. Can you maybe research what we could do with that? And that was a really good question because I had no idea how land rights and water rights, were they similar? Were they different? So that's how I started to research water. And then I wrote my master thesis on it and kind of rolled into my my PhD.
Right. And we'll talk about that later as well. But you're also a fellow at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities and Social Science, NIAS. What does that mean?
Well, NIAS actually provides opportunity for scholars to take some time off and to really dive into certain topics that they want to research. And for me, I wanted to look at rights of nature and how they, or how actually communities used rights of nature or to help formulate them, how they fought for them. And that was kind of the topic that I looked at. Legal mobilization, so how do societies or communities use the law, and rights of nature, so entitlements of rivers, forests, mountains.
And why did you choose to have academia as a tool to research those topics?
Well, I think I kind of rolled into academia by accident. So I thought researching was very interesting, but I never actually thought about being in academia until I became a student assistant and the professor asked me, hey, do you want to write an article together? And I thought, an article on what? And he was an expert in women's rights. He was part of the CEDAW committee, which is the UN Committee on the Rights of Women. And we started writing on how women's rights are actually implemented in the Netherlands. What are some of the challenges, especially when it comes to the Caribbean part of the Netherlands, and also how or whether or not the Dutch government is using women's rights when it goes overseas in conflict situations. And that was actually my first time that I started to think about, hey, I can write about these things. I can maybe there's a place for me in academia. And yeah, that's how I kind of started using these platforms as a way of drawing attention to certain topics that I find important.
And how difficult or easy is that? Because in the past couple of years, there's been a lot of discussion about accessibility within academia, within topics that are being addressed, diversity within academia and at universities as well. And Claudia Wecker researched a lot, especially in universities, and her report wasn't that positive.
No.
What is your experience in academia in regard to that topic?
I think we still have a lot to learn within academia. I don't think it's as accessible as it should be. If you look at the general demographic of the Netherlands, you actually need to see that reflected in academia, and you don't see that at the moment. For me, the access or the road to academia was it wasn't that challenging, but I have heard a lot of stories about others who have had a lot of difficulties getting there.
Why was it more easy for you? What made your accessibility better or easier than others?
I think luck. I really don't think it has anything to do with anything else than just luck. Having supervisors that are supportive, people suggesting that you go into academia or indeed giving you opportunities in that sense. And them guiding you along the way. I think for me, I kind of slipped through the cracks. I don't think academia was, meant for me, but I kind of just ended up there.
Do you see it changing in the past couple of years or not that fast?
I think there's more attention to it now, not only for diversity in academia, but also for different approaches. So now the decolonial approach is becoming more prevalent also in academia. But of course, we have to look at these things and see whether or not they are genuine, whether or not they will really bring about change. And also, whether or not it provides space for people to to be themselves within these spaces, and also to bring the science that we actually need.
Right. Your personal background, you are from Suriname. What you're researching is water. How important is your personal background in the topics that you're researching?
I think it helped me to see certain issues that others may not have seen because of personal experiences. So for me, also being of Maroon background and knowing that those communities in Suriname don't have access to water or experience certain challenges, made me more sensitive to those issues.
What's the insight? Can you give an example of an insight that you have which benefits your research as well?
Well, one of the things was when I visited my family who lives in the interior of Suriname, I was actually just walking with my nephews to the creek where they were going to swim. And I looked at the creek and I thought, it doesn't look the way it's supposed to look. But my nephews were playing and I asked my uncle, I said, the creek looks different. He said, yeah, because of the gold mining. It has been taking place in the little bit back of the village, but it has been the affluents or the mercury has been leaking into our creeks. So that was actually what my nephews were playing in, and yeah, so that type of direct connection, or that you can actually see what type of impact it has.
Right.
That made me aware of those issues. And
it is your mission to rethink the way people and the environment are related. How did you get to that specific topic in order to research that?
Well, I think what we're seeing right now is that there's a lot of focus on climate change and the issues that we are experiencing in that sense. But I think we should start off with, how do we treat the environment? How is the environment a part of our lives? How do we relate to the environment? Because that is what has led to these climate change issues. You often see a disconnect between the two. And I'm trying to address that so that we can see that we need a structural change and not just happenstance solutions for certain issues.
Do you believe in a structural change? Because the reports are there. You're part of the UN Harmony with Nature program as well. So it's a global topic that deserves a lot of attention. But still, the structures and the economical structures that we've built are so stubborn in a sense. Are you optimistic that we are able to change it?
Not really.
Oh, God.
Sorry. I'm not really optimistic, but I'm still here, still trying to address these issues. But issues of change also relate to power. And I think in that sense, addressing power or having certain powerful actors actually allowing room for change, that is what is the most challenging, I think.
Can imagine that. I'm not that happy that you're not that optimistic. Realistic, maybe. What does your current research focus on?
Right now, I'm focusing on 3 different issues. So I focus on environmental justice in different contexts. So the first one is in the Dutch context. So looking at how in the Netherlands, different communities, different neighborhoods are experiencing environmental issues differently. I look at it also within the relationship between the European Netherlands and the Caribbean Netherlands, especially when it comes to issues such as hurricanes and the vulnerability that the islands are experiencing. And I also try to look at it from the rights of nature perspective. So what type of entitlements can we give to nature? Will that help? How are communities fighting for these rights, etc.?
Yeah, because we have to realize that the Kingdom of the Netherlands is more than only the country, bordering the North Sea. It's bigger than that. And the responsibility, therefore, is bigger than that as well.
Yes, exactly.
Right. And why did you say yes to become a scholar for designing cities?
Because I think it's an interesting way to talk about these issues. I think it's also nice for me to be able to invite people that I've always wanted to talk to and to engage in conversation about these topics. But I think it will be a good way of also including others, including other disciplines, also having more content for students that they can look at instead of reading. So I think that will be a good bridging experience.
Talking about bridges, this is a perfect bridge to our next two guests, because they're here because you invited them. And we talk about Nawal Mustafa, who's a lawyer and activist, a PhD student at the University of Amsterdam and a co-founder of Speak. And the other guest is Rosalba Ikaza. She's an associate professor in global politics, gender and diversity at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam.
Yes.
Why specifically those two guests? What does interest you in Nawal, for example?
Well, Nawal and I have known each other for a long time. I think maybe even 15 years. A long time. And she has done amazing things. I think she's always a very critical voice. She has read, I don't know how many books, 1,000 books. So she has a lot of knowledge. And we also both are from the legal field. So we have a lot of discussions about what is the role of the law, how can the law be used, what is wrong with the law. And I think that is something that we will be discussing today.
Great.
As well.
And we've also got Rosalba, of course, Rosalba Ikaza, associate professor. Why did you invite Rosalba?
Well, first of all, she's now a full professor. She will have her oration later this year. But again, she's also a very critical voice, and she looks at things from mostly a decolonial perspective, but also she asks a lot of good questions about positionality of researchers themselves. So who are you? How do you do research? Do you justify it? Do you explain it? Do you not take for granted the position that you have as a researcher?
Great. Well, a warm welcome to you both, and very happy that you were able to join the program. Nawal, if I can start with you, can you tell us what kind of cases do you focus on as a lawyer, and how is that connected to your PhD research?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me, Daphina. We have known each other for a long time indeed, and congratulations to Rosalba. So lawyer. I don't know if I would use the label lawyer because I haven't done the bar. So I'm a jurist. I don't know what the English term for that is. And the cases that I work with are usually on more voluntary basis because and as an intermediator between people who for instance, migration law is something that I'm connected to, and usually what I do is, for instance, be a mediator between legal professionals and people who are encountering the law. For instance, I have a Somali background, and I see Somali people who are struggling to get their rights acknowledged, and often in migration, but also in terms of social security, access to social security and so on, and employment, etc. So that's something that I do. It doesn't really relate to my PhD because my PhD is about I'm based at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam at the law faculty with the migration section. And there what I do is focus on a more critical perspective on migration history and law. Specifically connected to the intimate sphere. And what I mean with that is I look at relationships between people who are racialized differently, for instance, Black men and white women, and how the law has been used to make their lives difficult, for instance. So usually in Europe, we pretend that we haven't segregated along racial lines, unlike the US or South Africa. But what I'm trying to do is show that we didn't really need prohibitions necessarily to prevent interracial mixing, but that existing laws, specifically immigration laws and criminal law, has been used to either criminalize or prevent these relationships.
And how does that connect with the research topic that Daphina has? focusing on environmental rights or environmental justice. Because in the lens we saw that the case against Shell in court helped to prove a point. Is there a connection for you there as well?
Definitely. I think definitely as a legal professional and a scholar, I am interested in everything that Daphina has been doing for the past years. I heard her say earlier that it was luck, but I think it was also brilliance that enabled her to succeed in academia, because academia is not a easy field to succeed in, and she has been succeeding. So I just wanted to flag that and point that, because I also see this conversation as a celebration of Daphina's work for the past years. The connection that I see is not only legal but also personal for me. As I said, my roots are in Somalia. Since the 1980s, there has been drought in Somalia, extreme drought, and because of climate change, right? So a lot of people have been displaced. There is more than 4.5 million people who have been impacted this year alone by the extreme drought in Somalia. There hasn't been a successful rainfall for more than 4 years. 4 rainfalls have failed, which means that it impacts people's food security. It impacts the animals, their farming capabilities. So it has a lasting impact on them. It forces them to move. So you have a lot of internal displacement within the region. It's not only Somalia that has been impacted for the past decades, actually, but also the complete Horn of Africa has been impacted by climate change. And what you see is, and that's what I think it's so valuable by Daphina's work, is the fact that she transcends national boundaries or regional boundaries and looks into like Suriname and looking at the Dutch kingdom as a whole is very valuable to take accountability, to force nations who benefited, wealthy nations who benefit from labor, from the resources of continents like Africa, to take responsibility. And this specific issue has been a reoccurring of drought in Somalia has been a reoccurring issue. It's Ramadan now, and there hasn't been a Ramadan for the past, I think, 10 years that we haven't been collecting money for people to survive the drought. It has a huge impact on children, on women, and what you see is.
But still, how does I can see how it affects climate change affects the people, but how can the legal work do justice to that?
Yeah, I think what Daphina is doing is redefining what law can do and what how you can use legal mobilization to fight for certain rights. And I think it's valuable in that way. In the case of Somalia, until now, it's usually in terms of development, in terms of aid, right? But if you change the perspective and look at it as Daphina has been looking at these issues, then it becomes an issue of rights and accountability, and not something that poor nations are. It's not the fault of poor nations, right? So the conversation shifts, right. And I think that analyzing and showing what legal provisions are involved and how other marginalized communities have used the law to gain access or to improve their situation is what has been inspirational to me, and something that I hope in the future, when I'm done with the PhD, I can use to advocate for the rights of Somali people as well.
Thank you so much. Rosalba, you work at a crossroads at the intersection of politics, gender and globalization. Can you explain to us how that connects with the work that Daphina does?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really an honor to be with these amazing women, and also I joined the celebration for Daphina's work and contributions. Well, I'm an intersectional feminist, and I'm also a decolonial scholar. And something that for us as researchers is very important is constantly ask where are we positioned in the world to experience different phenomena, like, for example, climate change or the possibility of accessing, a clean environment. And this is actually something that for me is very important, because then I can bring a complexity in the analysis and, try to, explain to others that it's not the same experience, like with institutions, with, Daphina was giving the example of academia. Well, social phenomena is not experienced in the same way. And someone that comes from the Global South, I'm originally from Mexico, now living in Europe for a long time, I am very aware of how not only the effects of climate change are being, very harsh in already marginalized, historically marginalized communities and societies around the world, but also here in the global north, in cities, for example, like The Hague, which is one extremely unequal, and in which people are experiencing lack of access to, rights and justice in different ways, depending on the historical marginalizations that they have, inherited from diverse moments in history of this country. So the way I come into this conversation is someone that is concerned about the intersectionality of the oppressions in which the question of climate change is so important to be located in.
Right. And how can you bring about that change? Because it's getting the focus on researching, but what steps can you take in order to change the situation for people that are affected? For example, in The Hague, what can you do?
Well, I think that has already been addressed a little bit by what Daphina has been sharing with us. I think that everything starts with actually changing the terms of the conversation. If we are constantly focused on pretending that the solutions that we have are going to fit for everyone, then we're starting with the wrong solution in the first place. Secondly, if we start by imagining that every people is going to benefit in the same way from solutions or from policy interventions, then we're still in the same problem. But more importantly, from my point of view, I think that it's very important to change the terms of the conversation. And one way of doing that is actually learning from experiences from places, communities like here in The Hague, but also in the Global South, and I mean geographical Global South, where communities are addressing the question of accessibility, but also of, sustainability in ways in which the community is at the center, not private enterprises, not individualism, but actually communities, preservation of the life of communities. So changing the terms of the conversation actually means that you need to learn from experiences that are not so close to you. And this sometimes causes a lot of problems. People don't feel comfortable of, speaking from perspectives or with perspectives that they don't really know or that are not, closer to their own personal experience. So by changing the terms of the conversation, I mean, let's learn from successful experiences of people mobilizing for their rights, and let's start to think how this can actually be, changing how we speak about people in the Global South, actually changing the destiny, changing the way they are addressing the question of environmental of climate change and accessing environmental justice.
But I wonder what role do researchers play in this, in this topic, and does it change methodologies as well? Are there new methodologies at hand to have people that are not usually being heard, to give them a platform or a voice?
Well, this is something that academia can contribute to. And let's also be very clear that research per se is not something neutral. Research is always political, and something that we can actually start to ask, and this is something that we constantly ask at ISS, is who is being, benefiting from the research we are. And this immediately starts to challenge the way you approach the phenomena per se. So it calls from designing research differently. It calls for, of course, choosing different ways of working, including methodology, but also methods. And it also calls from another way of thinking on to whom you are responsible, or who is the person who at the end of the day is going to benefit from the research that you are doing. I think that Daphina gave an excellent example. She saw the experience of problems of water accessibility, and then she did something about it. And something that we can do as researchers is actually be very clear what kind of interest our research is benefiting. We know that universities for a long time in many places like in the US, the Ivy Leagues, universities and many universities here in the Netherlands are actually doing research that is for the benefit of big transnational corporations or mining companies. And this is something that is very rarely addressed. So just by addressing this and starting to position our research politically, and not just academically, but also politically and ethically, I think that we're contributing to change the way we do research. This doesn't mean that we're not going to produce good science. Actually, it's a much more truthful science if we actually, problematize who is being benefiting from the research that we are producing.
But what I worry about is that maybe the awareness is there that it should be changed in the way that you describe, but the knowledge or the practice isn't there yet. So is it enough to have that awareness and those ideas, and how can you put it into practice?
I think that the challenges of bringing experiences and knowledges is still there in universities. Universities are very difficult places for, bringing ideas that might be simply appropriated or extracted for the benefit of becoming famous or having lots of papers under your name. This is the logic of university, and the awareness is not just about the vastness of the knowledge that we can access, but also of, let's say, the extractivist nature that can exist in just accessing and then publishing with that knowledge. That awareness is growing up. And is not by chance, and I don't think that is by luck, that this is actually taking place more and more among scholars, not only in this country, but in many other countries, who come from migratory backgrounds, who are on the margins of university, on the margins of academia and of society. Why? Because it's very clear that the way we relate to knowledge, the way we relate to our home countries, the way we relate to the communities that are not only here but there, is important for us. So we need to find ways in which these knowledges, these experiences are validated without being extracted, that are, inspiring for the work we do, the things we teach, the readings we choose, for our courses, in a way that is not simply appropriated, but in a way in which challenges, let's say, the usual solutions that we are constantly hearing, in a way that opens the possibility for the people who really wants to change things to be, transformed by these knowledges that are constantly marginalized or misrepresented or extracted. It sounds like too abstract, but it's happening every day in our classrooms. It is happening just by decisions of the readings that we put in place in our classrooms. And I think that this is inevitable. I'm, in that sense, a little bit more optimistic than Daphina, because I can see students also demanding this sort of, approaches to the research we do, in which we're not only reading the same people, providing the same solutions. Students here in the Netherlands and everywhere are demanding, who is actually in my curriculum? Are we going to repeat the same sort of, same sort of discourses, the same sort of narratives about environment? Then we are doomed. We really need to be much more careful and listening more carefully to solutions that are coming from places that we never see as, holders of knowledges, holders of innovation. And this is being demanded by students as well.
Yeah, it's good to see that on different kinds of levels, those changes are happening and being demanded. And I do recognize what you say, that the change begins with the students as well. They take up a lot of awareness and responsibility as well to change their own educational systems. And you hope that the educational systems are open to that change as well. Thank you so much for now. Please stay online with us, because we hope to return to you later. But now I'd like to focus with Daphina on the triptych, because we're organizing 3 programs with you. And you've thematized the programs that we are going to address as well. So can you tell us a little bit more about your focus that you will have in the triptych?
Yes. So the theme is going to be realizing environmental justice, and we have 3 focus areas. So the first one will be focusing more locally within the Netherlands, looking at how complex inequalities lead to environmental issues, or how communities that experience complex inequalities also deal with environmental issues.
Can you give an example of that?
So, for instance, communities who are considered of lower economic social status live in areas that are often more polluted than other communities. Now, this does not only mean that they will probably experience the worst outcomes of this pollution, but also that they often don't have access to, for instance, healthcare or to different legal avenues to address the issues that they're experiencing. So you can see that there is sort of a layering of different inequalities that exacerbate each other. So it's not only the area where they live, but it's also access to different avenues of addressing the issues that they're experiencing. And we will be talking about it with different experts who've done research on this topic in relation to air quality, for instance, but also in relation to different inequalities. Yeah.
There's a movement in the past years that came to the mainstream, so to say, that if you talk about environmental justice, you also talk about the rights of non-human things like rivers, like animals. Does that play a part in your research as well?
Yes, so that will be addressed, I think, in the last, in the third part, we will be looking at more of a global perspective. And there we will look at, indeed, marginalized communities. And those are also often the communities that will or want a different connection or different relation with nature to be central. And that's where you see rights of nature come to the fore.
Yeah. And if you talk about environmental justice, what is the definition for you? What does that mean?
That's a very good question. It means that we're dealing with environmental issues. So we have issues such as environmental degradation, and the justice part really relates to how different communities are experiencing it differently, and how they also will need different solutions to be able to deal with what they are experiencing. So, for instance, if you indeed have communities in The Hague that are, for instance, dealing with heat waves, which lead to more suicides, which lead to more deaths among elderly.
Heat waves lead to more suicide?
Yes.
What is that connection?
That is a connection that is outside of my research area, but there's a lot of literature on done by people within psychology and also within public health that have noticed that there is a connection between heat waves and the amounts of suicide that occur. And you also see that with deaths among elderly people. So if you are able to identify which communities are experiencing the most negative sides of these environmental issues, then those are also the communities that you will have to assist or facilitate certain things with, or take away certain barriers.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about law and the role of law and the role that law can play in changing society. What is your vision on that? And does that return in your, do we see that back in your programs as well?
Yes, so law has been, well, I should first state that law is not necessarily neutral. So law goes hand in hand with power, because the way we make laws is often by majority rule, right? But what also happens is that law has been kind of facilitating the environmental degradation that we've seen by bringing about concepts such as private property or other issues which have basically kind of created or designed this system where we can exploit environment in certain ways. And in that sense, we can see that the law has a role or played a role, but it's also playing a role in addressing those issues. So you can sort of hijack the law to kind of get to certain solutions that you want to get to. So, for instance, rights of nature is an example of that, but also law cases such as Urgenda is also trying to kind of push against what we know law to be and how it can be used to address certain issues.
Because there's a lot of discussion now in the Netherlands in, to what extent judges can function as lawmakers. With your judicial background. How do you feel about that?
I think there are two things, and this is often said indeed in relation to the case such as Urgenda, where the judge for the first time has said that the government has a responsibility towards its citizens. Yes, towards its citizens, not necessarily those within the Netherlands, but that's another discussion. And that it should try to eliminate or try to minimize the CO2 emissions. That hasn't happened before. And some people are indeed arguing that, yes, this is actually the judge stepping in the shoes of politicians, kind of orchestrating what we should do. Now, I think that the Urgenda case could not have been done 10 years ago. I think the judges were kind of pushed because we have such a, because there's such an urgency and we have only a few years left. And also the judges have said that the government needs to do something, but it hasn't really said exactly what the government needs to do. So the government can make its own measurements, make its own activities the way it deems fit. So in that sense, I don't think that the judges have stepped outside of their boundaries.
But do you agree that they're activist judges, or are they not?
No, I think the law is always changing or always open to interpretation. That's why we have so many legal scholars that interpret the law. And I think that the judges have done within reason what is possible.
And do you believe, because you just said law isn't neutral, what do you mean by that?
Because laws are made by people. So by definition, they cannot be neutral.
And who benefits from them and who doesn't get the right benefits from them?
Depends on who makes the law. And
if you talk about environmental justice.
Yes. Well, then it depends. So what we've seen for the longest time is that environmental law was mostly about management of natural resources. So indeed, how to exploit it, what is kind of the limitation of what you can do, but not necessarily about conservation or protection of environment. And that is, of course, because we have a lot of exploitative industries that benefit from such construction or such design. So it really depends on who is behind the scenes to make certain laws.
Great. I wonder if there are any questions from the audience, because you're more than welcome to post them. For the people at home, you can go to menti.com and post your questions there. And for the people here, they can do that as well. Or maybe some question pops up right now. Yes, go right ahead. I will repeat the question.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Is there? Oh, there's a microphone too.
Mike. Hi. I heard you say, do you think that the Urgenda case couldn't have happened 10 years earlier? While I agree that might be the case, it also kind of flagged like how the rationale is already that racism is so normal because climate change has happened. Like the amounts of natural disasters between 1900 and 2010 have increased by tenfold. So Bangladesh has been feeling it since the 70s, or different countries, like you said, have been experiencing it for decades, and Europe has been the biggest driver. Can you reflect on the way racism is naturalized within that analysis of it couldn't have happened 10 years earlier? Because also in 1990, or when the climate summits started, 1992, 1990, there was already a long fight to get differentiated but common responsibilities. I'm forgetting the exact term.
That's good too.
But that has been fought for before the 1990s. So that would have given already a clause to actually say we have a differentiated responsibility because we've caused the climate change already for such a long time.
Let's hear what her answer is.
Yes. So those were a lot of questions. Let me see where to start. So indeed, what we see is that there's a divide, right? A global divide between the global south and the global north, where the global north has most of the responsibility and also most of the impact that it's caused through relating to climate change. And indeed, we see that the voices from the global south are not being heard in general. They are often being ignored. They try to go to these summits. They are being pushed out. They don't have any access to the podiums to talk. We've seen that also last in Glasgow. And this was also exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, for instance. And that was also then related to the lack of access to vaccines, which actually made a lot of diplomats not be able to come to Glasgow to talk about these issues. So you see a lot of, indeed, oppression when it comes to addressing these issues. I think in relation to Urgenda, what is interesting is that, and that's also why I was talking, because the Supreme Court basically talked also about citizens, right? It was very much focused on Dutch citizens, which I think is very interesting because human rights are for those who are within a territory. So anyone who lives here has the same, more or less, the same rights, especially when it comes to climate change and CO2. So I think it's very interesting that there's still a focus on the protection of citizens here and not necessarily those outside of the borders, even those within the Dutch Caribbean. So you see that there is indeed a tendency to focus very locally, to exclude marginalized communities, unfortunately. And therefore, sometimes the approaches can be very limited. And I think that we have to be very careful not to continue certain structures of oppression in the way that we try to address climate change.
But still, the question also was that this couldn't happen in 10 years ago. So what improvements have been made in the past 10 years that it could happen now?
Well, I think the conclusion is that no improvements have been made, and that's why the judges needed to say something, because otherwise the targets would not have been reached, and they still haven't been reached. I mean, so
the government things got worse, and that's why judges feel that they have to intercept.
Yes, because it's not necessarily that judges want to intercept, but it's also because the government said that it would live up to a certain expectation. So it has signed certain treaties. It has said that it's committed to addressing these issues. And we've now gone past 2020. The government still hasn't addressed it. Urgenda is going back to court to try to address it. But then again, you see the limited impact that law can have.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Either here. Yeah, there's a question over there.
Thank you for the conversation. I want to tie three ideas together and get your input about that. And it's the idea that we need structural changes regarding environmental justice. The idea that maybe the rights of things that are not human might be part of that structural change. And the final idea is that maybe these laws, if they are in place, like in other countries like Ecuador or Colombia, where rivers have rights or like biodiversity has rights, might be just a shortcut and like a source of environmental conflict when the law kind of steps into communities without regarding their use, their relation to nature, and their possible solutions to environmental issues, like Isabella was pointed out.
What's your response to that?
No, that's a good point. I think what I find interesting about the whole rights of nature movement is that, again, because it's a law, it's constructed by people, that it doesn't necessarily mean that it will have positive outcomes. It really depends on the system that's around it, whether or not it will have a positive outcome, and whether it will address certain underlying issues. Also, we see examples of rights of nature also sometimes being used against communities that are actually dependent on, for instance, certain rivers. So we've seen examples of that in Bangladesh, for instance, where informal communities were removed from rivers because they were saying now the river has rights, and that is not the way that we envision rights of nature to be used or to be impacted. Yeah. So I think that even in such I think a positive development, we still need to see what are the outcomes, how is it being used, and what are the effects of it.
Right. Rosalba, is that something that you would like to address as well?
Well, I think that it's very important as well to come back to the first part of my input, that was where are we positioned when we are speaking about the rights of nature, and in which ways the possibility of understanding where all of these solutions are coming from, and if these solutions are coming from, for example, from states that are not necessarily, sources of legitimacy or sources of fair and justice, then it's quite it's not really a surprise that some of these solutions are not going to be solutions, but are going to be part of the problem. And speaking from the context of Latin America, when we revisit these constitutional rights that were brought by different governments in South America, one also has to understand that, the states, even though that could be in the hands of previously and historically marginalized communities, are particularly oppressive, violent institutions. So in many cases, if we only see solutions as coming from states and governments, I think that we are actually losing the possibility of understanding that these are part of the problem sometimes, not necessarily part of the solution. And this is tapping into what Daphina was saying about law. And it's the same with law. We cannot assume that law is going to be something positive for everybody, or that it's going to be impacting equally to everybody. There are historical legacies that we cannot forget, and the role of states, especially in First Nations, in indigenous communities, is the source of many violences: physical, material, economical, but also epistemic. Ethnocide comes definitely in my mind every time that I think about how some rights of nature have been enshrined without actually consulting, without actually understanding how this was supposed to affect communities in South America. But speaking here as well, I think that one of the main problems is that if we focus just on solutions from the state or from the government, without actually understanding that in many communities, marginalized communities, the internal orders of Europe, the states are not trust. Actually, these are sources of violence. These are sources of impositions of decisions that were, designed from a particular position that is a normative position, someone that has access to law, access to health, has the right passport. Of course, it's not going to be a solution. It's going to be part of the problem.
Great. I hear you loud and clear. Thank you so much. There's been a question through Menti, and that goes, there's been a discussion in science on the effectiveness of conservation types, protected areas versus more socially oriented conservation, like multifunctional landscapes. How do you look at it?
That's a very interesting topic. Conservation is historically a very problematic topic, or a challenging topic, because conservation has often historically been used to marginalize communities. So to remove communities from the areas where they were living, to use that land for other purposes. So in general, conservation, as we know, like conservation areas are not necessarily positive. So indeed, trying to look for alternatives where communities should actually just be allowed to live where they have been living for centuries, and to look at what type of other issues are impacting, for instance, drought issues or others, which sometimes the causes of that actually lie outside of the communities and not within the area where the impact is actually being experienced.
But if you look at the maroon communities that are in Suriname as well, how would you protect those without, you know, creating conservation areas? But how will you go about that?
Well, they are also actually an example of communities that have been pushed out of certain areas. And that is also why you see this tension between between conservation and also the mining explorations and those communities that are still.
What would be the right way to do it?
To not have conservation areas.
And how do you make sure that the areas being conserved for following generations to come?
Well, then you need to make other livelihoods available to these communities. So, for instance, because it's often not the maroon communities that are cutting the trees, or they are, for instance, sometimes mining, but it's only out of necessity. So you need to make certain other livelihoods available in order to protect those areas. But you shouldn't be pushing people out of...
No, I know, but within maroon communities, there's a problem with plastic, for example, or with trash. I mean, people produce trash and there's no service, in the area that maroon communities live in order to clean that up. But still, you wouldn't want to push them out. But what deals can be made in order to preserve that area as a livable area?
Yeah, but I think the solutions you're trying to look for shouldn't be just in this moment in time, because I think a lot of the issues actually come from those communities being marginalized, not being connected to the infrastructure because the government actually didn't see them as worthy of having access to certain resources, to certain infrastructure, etc. And also to not have them included in what type of solutions you are providing. Because I think a lot of these communities would be very happy if they would be able to live on their own terms and not need access to plastic because they don't have electricity, so they need to have one-use products because they don't have refrigerators, for instance, or those type of things. And this is all because of historical oppression. So, yeah, you need to, and it doesn't just start with one thing. I think it needs to start with getting access to education, getting access to healthcare, getting access to all of those things if you want to make sure that those areas are preserved for future communities. And I also, again, want to say that they historically are not necessarily the communities that have been destroying these areas, because they have a direct connection or direct dependency on these areas. And they also have been trying to fight in court for a type of self-determination that includes protecting those areas.
Right. Let's look into the future, because, like I said, we will be curating a triptych. Can we go to each episode and see what the themes will be and who will be speaking? If we go to the first edition, that's happening on May 16th, and the topic is the complexity of inequity. What does that mean, and what will we be talking about?
Yeah, so that will be the episode where we'll be addressing different types of inequalities, so socioeconomic inequality, environmental degradation, and how communities are experiencing that. And like I said, we will have a researcher who looks into air quality, who's, for instance, looked at Utrecht and how in different neighborhoods of Utrecht there is an, how do you say that? They go over the limits of what air quality should be. And we will also talk about what type of health impacts that has on people. It goes further than just, for instance, lung diseases that you can develop, but also cardiac issues, as well as it also affects unborn children, for instance, who are still in their mother's belly. So the effects of air pollution go very far. And we will also talk about, indeed, how these different inequalities interact with each other.
And you've invited Julian Ageman, George Downward, and Robert Funk. Why those three?
Yes, so Julian Ageman will be speaking about how cities are designed and how environmental degradation influences that. He has experience in both the UK and the US. George Downworth is the researcher from Utrecht University. We'll talk about his air quality research. And Robert Vonk is from the Raad voor Volksgezondheid en Samenleving. So that is a Dutch institute who looks at how society and health, how they relate to each other.
Right. And the second edition will be about the climate and the kingdom.
Yes. So we will be looking at the inequality within the kingdom, so focusing on what type of impact, climate impact, the Caribbean islands are experiencing, why they don't have any access to environmental justice or climate justice through the legal framework. For instance, the different climate agreements that the Netherlands has signed, they don't apply to the Caribbean islands. So what type of impact does that have? So we will be discussing that with some experts.
Great. And Tacho Barefoots and Jolien Buiten, what would you like to tell about them?
Yes, so Tacho works for the Dutch Caribbean Nature Association, if I'm saying it out of my head. Yes, and he will be talking about how challenging it is to address certain issues through his organization. And Jolien Buiten, who's part of the D66, has been advocating for including the Dutch Caribbean islands in a lot of different issues, also on socio-economical issues. But she will also talk about the climate agreements.
Right. And then the final and third edition will be about mobilizing international communities. Tell us more.
So we'll be looking at different cases where local communities have been successful in addressing or in using the law and kind of hijacking the law to address the issues that they are dealing with. And we will be also looking at a different film about, for instance, the US and how children have been using the law there. And we'll be looking at some local examples.
Yeah, and Urgenda will be, the representatives of Urgenda will be here as well.
Yes.
But also Radha de Sousa, tell us more about Radha.
Radha, so she's a professor from the UK, and she has been organizing the Climate Court. Some of you might be familiar with that, which is more of an artistic but also legal interpretation of elders from different communities suing different companies and corporations, and she will be talking about that.
Very interesting. And you will be also hosting a book club.
Yes.
What will we be reading?
And we will be reading All We Can Save. It's not part of here. Yes. And it's a collection of essays from different women, mostly US-based though. But there are women of color talking about what type of mostly feminist approaches we can take to address the climate change situation.
Right. The series is called, and the whole program is called Designing Cities for All. What role does design or redesign play in your triptych?
Well, I think the redesign is how I look at the law. So how we can redesign the law to actually address the issues that we want to have addressed. So I think in that sense, I definitely see the law as a design issue, and also how it impacts how different areas are designed. We have a lot of regulations also about area design and how that then relates to health impacts and environmental degradation. How we can also talk about the things that the law allows. So those will be the issues that we will be addressing.
And we'll be seeing Noelle and Rosalba back, or not?
I hope so. I hope that they will join the conversations.
Because we're entering now the final stage of our conversation. And Noelle, is there anything you'd like to address that we about the topics that we just talked about?
No, I think much has been said, and I'm really glad to be part of the conversation and hopefully continue to be part of the conversation. And I'd like to thank you and Daphina for hosting and for inviting me.
More than welcome. Rosalba, you've opened a lot of minds tonight. You are more optimistic than maybe we share the opinion at the table. What would your advice be for Daphina when researching it in the next couple of weeks?
Oops, that's a tough question because I think that Daphina has lots of answers to that question, where to start. But perhaps my suggestion will be that where to start is important, but also how, and who is invited, and through which perspectives that we look into what we aim to redesign. At the end of the day, I think that if the goal is to think critically about the role of law and the role of law as design, let's not forget that the end goal is justice, and justice has so many different entry points, so many pluralities of understanding of what is supposed to be, preserved in a fair and just way. So many understandings of Earth and our relation to Earth that necessarily law is not going to be able to include, not even a plural perspective of law. So that will be my suggestion. Also changing the terms of the conversation, of the legal conversation in itself. That would be my suggestion. But of course, I'm not a legal expert. I'm just teasing Daphina here.
But Nawal's a legal expert. Some final closing remarks from you.
So I totally agree. I think it's essential if you want to look at the law, and I like the fact that Daphina is also talking about how cities, the openbare ruimte, the public space is designed, and how the law plays a role in that. I think it's important to take the law serious. I think it's one of the instruments that we can use. But in order to be successful, or in order to be meaningful, we also should be aware of the fact that the law is not neutral. The fact that in the Urgenda case, the focus is on citizenship, which is a really complicated and very problematic concept, is already telling. But for people like Daphina to kind of change the narrative and to kind of say, okay, the judges and so on are talking about citizenship, but actually human rights and environmental rights expand the limited understanding of citizenship, right? It's not related to nationality and so on. So those kind of conversations and sort of the bridging and interconnectedness of different regions are important. And I think that those conversations have been happening in anthropologies and anthropology, and more in the social sciences and so on, and less in legal scholarship, especially in the Netherlands, where the focus is more how do you apply the law, not necessarily how do you critique and redefine the law. And I think this is a great example of how you can engage with the law differently. So that's what I would like to add.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for your stories, your remarks, and your contribution to the conversations. We've come to the end of our program. Thank you so much, Daphina, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what the triptych will bring. Thank you to you, the audience. Thank you for joining us either online or here in Pakhuis de Zwijger. Please do join us for the rest of the triptych, and that will happen on the 16th, the 23rd, and the 30th of May. Like we said, Daphina is also hosting the Student Book Club for young designers and students with the book All We Can Save by Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. And applications for that are open from now on until the 29th of April. And the first meetup will be in the beginning of May, and you will receive a free copy of the book when you enroll. So that's also nice. In the meantime, we've started our Designing Cities for All series on participatory design, and join us for the next episode on April the 25th. Thank you so much for watching, and for more information about Designing Cities for All, please go to dezwijger.nl/DCFA. This is it for me. I wish you a very nice evening and hope to see you next episode. Bye-bye.